EuroVelo 1 was opened in 2012 at 11,000 kilometers. It is the longest cycle route in Europe and also the longest cycle route in the world. The last 1,000 kilometers were added in 2016. Since then, EuroVelo 1 no longer ends in Sagres at the Cabo de Sao Vicente, but runs all the way up the west coast of Portugal to Caminha. I cover the distance from Sagres to Lisbon in 4 extended day tours. Most of the time, the route runs on country roads with little traffic. The coastal plain is surprisingly hilly. Although it's already the end of October, I keep breaking into a sweat. The first stage takes me to the small town of Cascais. Shortly before I reach it, I leave the Route 120 and cycle toward the Atlantic Ocean to the Praia de Cascais. The beach is praised highly in Google Maps, obviously not without reason. The next day, on the 75-kilometer route to Sines, I again pass 2 coastal strips that are worth seeing. First, I come to the Cabo Sardau lighthouse, which towers above an impressive cliff. It stands at the westernmost point of the Alentejo. Then I continue via Vila Nova de Mil Fontes to Sines. Shortly before I reach the small town, I visit the beaches of Morgavel and São Torpes. The most famous son of Sines is the navigator Vasco da Gama. He was the first European to explore the sea route to India and sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. His statue stands next to the church Igreja Matriz do Salvador. From the hill on which the old town and the castle of Sines are located, the statue looks down on the large harbour. From Sines, it is again about 75 kilometers to Setúbal. The route is on country roads with little traffic, and this time it really is largely free of climbs. The last quarter on the Costa de Gale is over a narrow headland. From its northern tip, a ferry takes me to the peninsula on which Setúbal is located. Setúbal is an important port. Many voyages of discovery started here, and it was here that the Treaty of Tordesillas was ratified. In it, Spain and Portugal divided the world, with the Pope's blessing. The stage from Setúbal to Lisbon first leads me through the Arabida nature reserve. As I don't want to arrive too late in Lisbon, I skip the detour to the Cabo Especial lighthouse, which the EuroVelo 1 includes, and cycle directly to the ferry port of Seixal. The bridges over the Tagus River are closed to cyclists, but the ferry from Seixal takes me almost into the center of Lisbon, to the Cais do Sodre. Although I reach Lisbon in fading corona times and only at the end of October, the city is in full party mode. Not quite as bad as Santorini or Venice, but it is still a good example of over-tourism. The crowds strolling along the waterfront and in the alleys seem to appreciate the fact that there are only few sites. Most of them were destroyed during the great earthquake of 1799. But there are many belvederes and restaurants. I stay in a nice hotel that has been set up around a courtyard in former residential buildings in the middle of the old town. And here late October pays off, because the price is only 1/5 of what is charged in the high season. There are even a few new cycle paths in Lisbon. I not only explore the city center, but cycle out to Belém with the Hieronymus Monastery, the Tower of Belém, and the Monument of the Discoveries. I also cycle in the other direction, to the northeast, using a new riverside bike path. This takes me to the Parque das Nações, a new development on the Tagus River close to the airport. A year later, in September 2022, I resume my cycling tour in Lisbon. After Eurowings has handed over my bike intact at Lisbon Airport, I cycle through the same neighborhood, Parque das Nações, towards the west, first to Belém and then on towards the Atlantic coast. Cycle path-wise, it gets chaotic here. Sometimes there are cycle paths, but for the most part I rely on busy coastal roads. I don't find any signposts or maps showing the exact course of the route. I stay overnight in Cascais and cycle on to the Cabo Raso lighthouse the following day. Partly I can use well-developed cycle paths. But these end as soon as I ride up into the Sierra de Sintra, which reaches all the way to the coast. As the weather is rather gloomy, I get caught in a cool soup of fog and decide to skip Cabo da Roca, the most westerly point in continental Europe. That was a sensible decision. North of Sierra de Sintra and Praia Grande, the quality of the dirt roads is extremely poor and I have to push my bike for several kilometers. I am relieved when I reach the National Road 247 and stay on surfaced roads until I reach my destination for the day, São Pedro de Cadeira. On my next stage to the Peniche Peninsula, I stick to the country roads again. These take me to Lourinhã, Portugal's dinosaur capital. The paleontological finds here date from the Upper Jurassic. I arrive in Peniche early enough for a tour of the town and cycle out to the lighthouse and the Miradouro of Cabo Carvoeiro. The Phoenicians, Greeks and Romans had been to Peniche Peninsula already. Since ancient times, fishing played a major role. A strong fortress, the Fortaleza de Peniche, was built to keep out pirates and the English. Today, Peniche has about 28,000 inhabitants and the economic basis is no longer fishing but tourism. The beaches in the vicinity provide good surfing spots and the Berlengas are a special attraction. I visit these treeless rocky islands which lie about 10 kilometers off Peniche the following day. Only the largest island is inhabited. On it sits an impressive fortification from the 17th century. Today the Berlengas are a nature reserve for seabirds. North of Peniche, I leave the designated EuroVelo 1. It consists of only a few signposts anyway. As the weather forecast predicts 2 rainy days, I take the opportunity to visit Alcobaca, Coz and Batalha and set aside 4 days to do so. Alcobaca and Batalha are 2 impressive monastery complexes located about 15 kilometers inland from the coast. They are among the most important sites in Portugal and have World Heritage status since the 80s. The way up to Alcobaca goes by the Óbidos Lagoon. Here, attempts are being made to reconcile nature conservation with surf tourism, and there are even some cycle paths. Unfortunately, they don't go all the way up to Alcobaca. In the town, I put up at a nice hostel directly opposite the main entrance to the monastery. The history of the Santa Maria de Alcobaca monastery is closely linked to the emergence of an independent Portugal. Portugal's first king, Alfonso Henrique, gave the area to the Cistercian order in 1153. The core of the complex, the church and the adjoining first cloister, were completed in the High Middle Ages. However, the additions and extensions continued until 1755, including a library and a huge kitchen complex. In 1834, Alcobaca, like all the monasteries in Portugal, was secularized. After a long period of decay, the monastery is now excellently restored and one of Portugal's great sights. As I have to wait out another rainy day in Alcobaca, I visit the local wine museum. It is the largest in Portugal and shows the different stages of winemaking. It is only about 20 kilometers from Alcobaca to Batalha, but I make a detour via Coz. There I visit the church of the Cistercian convent of Santa Maria de Coz. It belonged to Alcobaca and was dissolved in 1834. The high altar with gilded carvings and the painted wooden panels on the sailing vault date from the 18th century. The choir stalls could seat over 150 nuns. From Coz I cycle to Batalha. I have reserved 2 days for this magnificent monastery complex. First, I visit the interpretation center of the Battle of Alcobaca. The museum is located on the plateau where the decisive battle between the Portuguese troops and the Spanish invasion army took place in 1385. Without the victory, in which English archers played a role, there would probably be no independent Portugal. The museum has an outdoor area where the location of the different troops before the battle are marked with signs and coats of arms. The monastery of Batalha, the Mosteiro de Santa Maria da Vitória, 3 kilometers to the north, was built as a memorial for this victory in the Battle of Alcobaca. The equestrian statue of Nuno Álvares Pereira, who led the Portuguese army to victory, stands near the entrance. Construction lasted from 1387 to 1515. The monastery originally belonged to the Dominican order, and for about 100 years the Portuguese kings were buried here in the late Middle Ages. The unfinished chapels are particularly impressive, with the roof missing and the entrance gates built in Manueline style. From Batalha, I cycle via Marina Grande back to the coast. There, in the small village of São Pedro de Moel, I unexpectedly come across a very good bicycle path. It leads me close to the coast, past Praia Vea, Praia de Desquida, de Areia, and Praia de Vieira, in the direction of Figueira da Foz. Fortunately, I had booked a hotel about 15 kilometers before Figueira da Foz, at Praia La Rosa. This turns out to be a good move. The place is wonderfully quiet and has a very beautiful beach. The following day I cycle into Figueira da Foz by crossing the mouth of the Mondego River. There, salt flats with flamingos and ugly industrial areas compete for space. From Figueira, I take the coastal road that leads around Cabo Mondego and continue to a dead straight little road that is used to transport timber. The Estrada Florestal runs through sparse forests about 3 kilometers from the coast. Fortunately, this time I cycle on a flat coastal plain, and the road has been surfaced recently. Where that is not the case, its condition is catastrophic, and it can only be used at walking speed. After Praia de Mira, the Estrada Florestal turns into a straight country road that leads almost directly to Aveiro. Aveiro is sometimes called the Venice of Portugal. It lies in the lagoon landscape of the Ria de Aveiro and is crisscrossed by several canals. It used to be an important fishing port with large salines. But in early modern times, the harbour entrance silted up and the fertile land became swampy. Today, tourism is the main income source. Colorful boats ferry crowds of visitors up and down the canals, and the marshlands northeast of the city have been transformed into a nature reserve and hiking area. The next morning I leave the city on these narrow paths and cycle towards Porto. It's slow going, but the scenery is very beautiful. I meet only a few hikers and no other cyclists. Before I come upon the coastal road again, I have already covered almost half the distance to Porto. To reach Porto, I have to overcome several hills, but my hotel is in Vila Nova de Gaia, near the port wine houses on the southern banks of the Douro, and I locate it without any problems. I only have problems when the hotel owner forbids me to park my bicycle inside the building. It is the only time that something like this happens to me in Portugal or Spain. In Porto, the bear is dancing and tourism is roaring. The city I last visited about 15 years ago is hardly recognizable. Over-tourism par excellence. There's not so much to see, but plenty of restaurants, port houses and miradores. The sites are concentrated on both sides of the Ponte de Dom Luís. The steel arch bridge with 2 levels was planned in the 19th century by an architect who, together with Gustave Eiffel, had previously designed the Ponte Maria Pia, a little further upstream. On the left bank of the river, the branches of the large port wine houses and their advertising boats, the so-called rabelos, are lined up. On the right bank are the old town of Porto, as well as the 3 most important church buildings. The Porto Cathedral, the Igreja do Carmo, whose tower is the landmark of Porto, and the Igreja de Santa Clara, whose entire interior is decorated with gilded carvings. Gold and precious woods came from the Portuguese colony of Brazil. Close to these 3 churches is also the 19th century São Bento railway station, whose entrance hall is entirely decorated with azulejo ceramic tiles. And there, where the upper lane of the Ponte Dom Luís touches the north bank of the Douro, I attend a second fado concert at the Casa da Guterra. After 2 days in Porto, I cycle through the old town in the morning and then towards the mouth of the Douro. I am surprised when I meet crowds of pilgrims on foot who are also streaming out of the city. They are walking along the Portuguese coastal way of St. James, which is excellently developed from Porto. The Caminho Português has become increasingly popular in recent years. About 25% of the pilgrims to Santiago now take this route. There are probably 3 reasons for this. Firstly, the route from Porto is well developed and scenically beautiful due to its course close to the coast. Secondly, at 250 kilometers, it is much shorter than the Spanish way of St. James. And many pilgrims have already walked the Spanish way of St. James and are looking for new experiences. I try to follow the well signposted footpath with my bike. This is not always successful. For example, when sanddrifts have made the wooden footbridges through the dunes difficult to pass. But nevertheless, I reach Eposende, almost 70 kilometers north of Porto, without problems. From here, it is the same distance again to Caminha, a small town on the Rio Minho, the Spanish border river. On this route, too, I try to follow the Portuguese way of St. James as far as possible. Sometimes this is a bit problematic. For example, near the small town of Villa Praia de Ancora, but overall I am successful. On the other hand, a Spanish cyclist I meet the next day, who had chosen the route further inland, reports that this path is hardly signposted and has a lot of steep climbs. Although Caminha is a respectable small town in a scenic location, it is definitely not a worthy conclusion to the 11,000 kilometer long EuroVelo 1. Therefore, I decide to continue on the way of St. James to Santiago and choose Fisterra in Galicia as the new final destination. Cape Finisterre, declared the end of the world by the Romans, shares an interesting fact with the North Cape. Just as the latter is not the northernmost point of Europe, Finisterre is not the westernmost point of the continent. The westernmost point of Spain is Cape Turinan, about 20 kilometers north of Fisterra, and the westernmost point of the Iberian Peninsula is Cabo da Roca, which I passed not far from Cascais, but skipped because of the fog. The ferry in Caminha is out of service. Very nice for the local entrepreneurs who now transport the pilgrims across the Rio Minho in small boats. I quickly reach a Passaje, and here the next surprise awaits me. A wonderful cycle path that runs along the road 542 and takes me straight to Vigo. It runs very close to the coast, first to Agada and then onwards to Oia, and the unfortunately closed Mosteiro de Santa Maria de Oia to Bayona. Here the cycle path turns east along the Ria de Vigo, and soon I reach the extensive industrial zones and suburbs of Vigo. According to an old Galician wisdom, people work here, while in Santiago they pray, and in La Coruña they celebrate. As a city, Vigo is neither particularly beautiful nor particularly ugly, but definitely not a good place for cyclists. At least my hotel is very close to the centre, yet very quiet and comfortable. The next day I cycle along the Ria de Vigo to Redondela and then on to Pontevedra. Most of the time I can use small country roads or the footpaths of the St. James pilgrims, but a few times I have to take roads with heavy traffic. But unlike the Portuguese or the Germans, Spanish drivers are very considerate towards cyclists and keep their distance wherever possible. From Pontevedra I leave the agglomeration of Vigo, but don't cycle all the way to Santiago. Instead, I spend the night in the small town of Caldas de Reis. On this leg there's not much traffic, but there are quite a few hills. This also applies to the last part of the route to Santiago, but there are only 50 kilometers left, and they are quickly covered. On entering Santiago, I am greeted by Kercher, an old Winnender acquaintance, and immediately afterwards I see the towers of the cathedral. The restaurants are full, and from the street musicians to the souvenir sellers, life is bustling in all corners. Even at the pilgrimage service on Monday evening, no seating places are left. I rest for a day in Santiago and then cycle to Fisterra, almost 85 kilometers in a one-day stage. In theory, you ride downhill towards the coast, but in practice you struggle with lots of hills. Unfortunately, I can only rarely use the paths of the foot pilgrims and have to cover most of the distance on overland roads. This cycling route is not very beautiful, but Fisterra definitely is. The town lies on a peninsula, and I stay in a bed and breakfast above the harbour. In the evening I cycle to the utmost tip, where the Faro de Fisterra stands. Its purpose is to warn ships of the dangerous winter storms in this part of the Atlantic. But although it is the beginning of October, there are only a few clouds in the sky. The view stretches far out across the Atlantic, and the sunset is truly befitting of EuroVelo 1.